Welcome, everybody, to the February edition of the You Already Own It Cloud Office Hours. This month's topic is moving databases to the Microsoft Cloud. My name is Bob Ballard. I'm the principal cloud strategist here at Planet, and I lead the cloud strategist team. Many of you have seen their updates on blogs, as well as been out to meet with you to talk about various technology strategies, etc. So thanks for joining. So just at a high level, the agenda, we're going to talk about, give an update on moving the databases to the Microsoft Cloud. We have Scott Dowling, a new member of our team here to be the subject matter expert on this particular topic today. So you don't have to listen to my droning on for once for a month. We can bring somebody else in, and then of course we'll have open mic questions at the end. And obviously along the way, if you have questions, feel free to type them in the IM window. So the You Already Own It team is myself, Bob Ballard, Jerry Martin, Aaron Ward, George Scott, and Scott Dowling. That is the cloud strategist team here at Planet. All of us are ex-Microsoft employees with a pretty vast depth of knowledge across the Microsoft stack. Thanks to Mary Tucker, who keeps us all organized and cracks the whip to get things done, and of course the leadership of Steve Winter, the Vice President of the East Region and State, Local Government, and Education. So don't forget, everyone that's on this call is a You Already Own It customer. And as a result, you have a number of benefits, one of which is you can email the You Already Own It at go-planet.com with various kinds of questions, issues, concerns. Just if you need help, reach out to us. We promise to get back to you within 24 hours with some sort of response. And then, it might be that we need to follow up further. Again, please don't use this for emergency break fix. There are other avenues for that. But if you have questions like, hey, I hear, there's new features coming to Teams or OneDrive, and I'd like to know more about them. Can you answer some questions for me? That kind of stuff. Feel free to reach out on the alias, ask us anytime, and we'll jump in and help. So I have to say the SQL database into Azure it was a widely requested topic by our customers on both the You Already Own It portal and in general, as well as a lot of pending things. Look, we have the impending sunset of Windows 2008, SQL 2008 as well. Right, so suddenly there's a new sort of attention paid to what some of those options are. And in particular, there's a new option in Microsoft Azure called the Managed Instance that I don't think very many people know much about at all. And so I brought on Scott Dowling to the call, who is a former Microsoft SQL and BI solution specialist from Microsoft Government Team, and now a member of the Planet Cloud Strategy team, to talk us through. So Scott, why don't you go ahead and take over the deck and kick this baby off.
Thank you very much, Bob. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks again for introducing me. I'm very excited to be here, very excited to be the newest member of the Planet team. During my time at Microsoft, I'm very familiar with Planet Technologies and the assistance that they gave my customers during my time there. So I'm very excited to be a part of that team and be able to provide that type of level of effort for our customers out there that are looking to move towards the cloud. So as Bob mentioned, during my time at Microsoft, I did cover SQL Server and Azure during my time there, back when it was called Windows Azure, actually. And certainly one of the challenges that I had as somebody that came from a database background was that SQL and database platforms in general were not a driver into the cloud. As we all are probably familiar with the basic drivers in terms of dev test, low-hanging fruit workloads into the cloud, those initial steps that customers leverage to get their feet wet in moving into Azure, IaaS, and what we're seeing now over the last year and a half, into platform as a service as well. But it was typically the virtual machine or the workload or sometimes the application that was that driver, and not so much the database platform. And that was for a variety of reasons, especially in the platform as a service realm, what the capabilities were inside of the cloud, and what's there today. I think is definitely kind of changed the game driver in terms of how customers will look at the database platform and what that means in terms of moving to the cloud. So the first thing I want to do is kind of level set everybody, because I'm sure there's a wide variety of knowledge in terms of what's available inside of Azure for your database platforms and certainly for your BI. So I kind of want to level set what's available today, and what it really means to you and how it can be leveraged. So stepping back to the middle of last year, so certainly managed instances are going to be what I focus on today, but I want you to understand where that came from and what was there prior, because there are still some very great use cases around the single database instance and the elastic pool. Not so much the elastic pool for the folks that are probably on this call. This is really geared towards ISVs with SaaS applications in the cloud. The elastic pool is a database pool, essentially. That's a shared resource model that enables higher resource utilization efficiency, and all the databases within an elastic pool share predefined resources within that pool. So there are some serious cost savings for those organizations that are providing SaaS applications to a lot of customers out there. What we typically see today in terms of what customers are leveraging in Azure SQL is the single database. And typically that was an afterthought, right, in terms of maybe a new application that's being built within the organization inside of Azure Platform as a Service, and then deciding where that database is going to be retained. Sometimes it would be on premise, but if you were looking to reduce that latency between the actual code and the data itself, Azure SQL database, single database was typically the answer, and versus creating a new virtual machine, deploying your own SQL server on that virtual machine, and having to maintain that instance inside that VM, and of course the OS and everything that goes along with it. So it's important to understand that with the Azure SQL, with the single Azure SQL database, each standalone database, right? It's a database scoped solution that single database is assigned a certain amount of resources. There are some specific tiers around that with basic, standard, and premium, which I won't dive into today, but it really is dependent upon what type of high availability and disaster recovery and performance and IOPS you want with that single database. But the thing to understand is that the emphasis here is that this is database scoped. So when an organization from an enterprise perspective is looking at moving their databases, say you have 10 user databases on premise and you want to move those to the cloud, previously you would have to create 10 single Azure SQL databases, requiring your DBAs to manage each one of those databases separately, versus how you do it on premise, in which the databases belong to an instance, and you can manage and maintain those databases at an instance level. So for instance, you're probably all familiar with backup jobs, right? You create backup jobs for the databases, or leveraging the resource governor at the instance level, or firing off an email alert via DB mail, all these things that are an instance layer. So with the introduction of the managed instance, we now have that feature compatibility from on-premise now inside the cloud. So essentially, it's a SQL database managed instance offers that simplified instance scope programming model, just like your on-premise. The databases in your managed instance share the resources allocated to that managed instance, and also represents the management grouping of those databases. That's the big difference, and that's something we're going to drill down into as we go, and I'll show a little bit on a short demo, just so you can see it and see that it's pretty much exactly the same as it is on premise. The real goal is that you're able to leverage the platform as a service capabilities for your database image to really be able to allow to your DBAs to focus on more business-oriented solutions versus the day-to-day humdrum of DBA activities, of which I was a DBA for the state of Pennsylvania for almost a decade. So, I know that 90% of my day-to-day work was just redundant tasks that we would love to offload so we could start looking at how the business actually needs to run and operate. So the first thing that we're going to focus on here is, well, there's 4 tiers that we're going to take a look at. We're going to talk briefly about the fully managed service, some of the capabilities within SQL Server Managed Instance, the isolation and security within there, which is always the biggest driver when it comes to databases, and primarily a reason why data wasn't a driver into the cloud was always security requirements. I can remember the first days of Azure in working with government customers, and during my time also working with commercial customers, financial industry and banks. Moving data to the cloud was a very scary thought, but certainly with all of the built-in security features now within Azure, that's starting to become less of a conversation, if you will. And then we'll also talk about the new pricing options that are available with, you already own SQL Server on-premise. How does that translate into the cloud and things of that nature? Okay, so the first thing we'll kind of dive into here are the basic questions that people typically ask around, okay, what does a database in the cloud look like? So just to get these easy, low-hanging fruit talking points out of the way, it is 4 nines capable. Certainly that does increase depending upon what type of instance you're deploying. The PaaS features that we want to take advantage of here are your backups primarily, your high availability and disaster recovery story, right? That's a large part of what your DBA does day in and day out, is not only creating the plan for HADR, implementing that plan, but also monitoring and maintaining and testing that plan moving forward. So your backups are built in, full backups are weekly, differential backups are every 12 hours, transaction log backups are every 5 to 10 minutes. The backups are stored in geo-redundant storage blobs that are replicated to a paired data center, right? So at the very least, even if you're taking a general purpose, the lowest tier in terms of high availability and disaster recovery, you already have those backups stored and replicated in geo-redundant fashion. The backups, now this is one thing that might be a sticking point. So we all know that the first time Microsoft comes out with something inside of Azure, there's typically some limitations that might prevent a customer from leveraging that solution today. Really great examples when Azure SQL first came out and it was just single databases. The size restriction was 50 gigs. And that was when I was at Microsoft, and I had a very difficult time having those discussions because most databases are larger than 50 gigs for a production tier 1 workload. Here, the backup retention period by default is 7 days. You can increase that to 35 days. So there are some workloads out there where you are required to retain backups that are 35 days. So certainly we might want to wait on that, but certainly version 2, and as you know, as things get into the cloud, they tend to ramp up and expand very, very quickly. So just keep that in mind.
Scott, around that thought, is there a way to leverage, say, Azure Backup or some other process to move those backups to your own storage for longer than 35-day retention?
You can with the other Azure SQL solutions, not for Managed Instance at this time. You don't actually have access to the storage container for Managed Instance. They lock that down for security purposes.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Of course, your databases and your database backups by default are encrypted with transparent data encryption. So that's something you don't have to worry about right there. It's on and working the minute you deploy your Managed Instance. And of course, as a SQL Server DBA, my favorite platform as a service ability is that we no longer have to worry about managing the updates, the upgrades, and the patches of SQL Server instances themselves. So if you have tier 1 workloads running on-premise today, production workloads, odds are you're in a SQL Server cluster. Hopefully you're on an always-on availability group, but either way, at the end of the day, there is going to be a time where you have to upgrade that version of SQL Server. that was my least favorite part of the job because, as we all know, gremlins happen, right? So your whole day is spent staring at the screen, running. You know the steps you have to take. It's not hard, but you're just sitting there in a marathon, sweating, looking at your computer, praying that nothing goes wrong and brings down your cluster during your upgrade. So personally, for me, my favorite feature is not having to worry about that instance level care and feeding, right, and managing that. That's all built in as any other workload inside a platform as a service. Some other areas that I want to talk about are around the security. I also have another security slide where I highlight some of this as well. But I just want to do a high level overview. You'll see that I'm not going to get very technical in many of these slides because I just don't know the overall understanding of databases. It's a wide variety as I go from customer to customer. So I just want to keep this at a high level. I do get in depth at a few places. So hopefully I don't drag you too deep into the waters, but I just kind of want to get your mind thinking around some of these items. So within security, right, we have advanced security within built-in Azure SQL that detects threats and vulnerabilities in your databases, helps you enable to secure your data. We have threat detection for managed instances as well that detects activities indicating unusual, potential harmful attempts to access or exploit databases. Threat detection identifies potential SQL injections, access from unusual locations or data centers, access from unfamiliar principals, or potentially harmful applications. This builds upon, and there's portions of this that are still in public preview, so it's not for production workloads, but build upon the Office 365 information protection, right? Your ability to see who's trying to access it from where, with what, and be able to deny access. So as that starts to roll out, I mean, that's the dream of all DBAs in securing their data, is to have that type of dynamic access capabilities. The things that scare DBAs that are available within Azure SQL that, you know, if you started like me with SQL Server 2000, 2005, that have always been there, but have never been very good, kind of like BI reporting tools, right? Back in the day, they were there, they were hard to work with, or you didn't trust them fully. That's the things like automatic tuning. It is there, and it is very good. So as somebody who used to do performance tuning for SQL Server, and was one of my favorite jobs ever, to be able to take a long running query and be able to optimize it to run quicker. We tended in the old days not to use those built-in tools because it was very generic. Sometimes it would create a query with select star, right? Break all those rules that we knew not to do. But the logic built within the automatic tuning is very simplistic right now, but very valuable. So this eventually essentially analyzes your workload, provides you the recommendations that can optimize performance of your applications by adding indexes, important things like removing unused indexes, and automatically fixing the query plan issues. And of course, you have control over this, just like you do on-premise as well. Has some built-in monitoring capabilities that enable you to get insights into the performance of your databases and workloads and troubleshoot the performance issues. If you're familiar with the Azure portal at all, you have the ability to create your own dashboards, of which I'll show you one, that you can take some of these inherent built-in database monitoring graphs and reports and put them on your own dashboard. So as you give DBAs access or data analysts access to the Azure portal, certainly you want to lock that down to their workloads only, which you can do within Azure. But then they have that nice dashboard that they're coming in and looking at and get a pretty good holistic view of the environment versus what we used to have to do in the past, where we create an SSRS report and a lot of queries, a lot of connection to databases and the system tables or SharePoint dashboards or things of that nature. Automatically built in, plug and play type of solution. Also, quite a bit of built-in intelligence that automatically identifies potential issues in your workload, provide you the recommendations that can help you fix problems. So just like you see within Office 365 and Azure, some of those recommendations, which I can show you as well today, just some little things that help you stay on your toes, right? Make sure you're protected, make sure you're following best practices. I keep losing my mouse. There we go. So we're going to move on. One of the first, so the very first question is, okay, it's the same capabilities as on-premise SQL Server. So the next important question that you should ask is, okay, well, what is it compatible with? And Azure SQL Managed Instances are compatible with SQL Server 2005 and on. And as Bob mentioned before, this is great timing, right? We have SQL Server 2008 that's approaching end-of-life support. Microsoft is offering some incentives to help you extend that life of support. So probably the quick and most painless option maybe is to lift and shift that into an Azure virtual machine, where Microsoft's offering an extended 3 years of support on that. Anybody happen to check out the blog posting that we just put up around that? We're doing a lot of that with customers today. But in reality, what we should really be doing is taking a step back and saying, is Azure SQL Managed Instance really the right solution for you? Now, granted, it's new, so a lot of people don't know about it. So it's part of my job and part of the expectation of Steve and Bob and the Planet team that, we really want to get out there and have those discussions with you and see if this is the right fit. So keep that in mind. SQL Server 2005 and on. And I know there's still some 2005 workloads out there. I know there's still some SQL 2000 workloads out there, which will be a little bit more challenging. But if you have any 2005, then this is really right up your alley, perhaps for the next step. So migration from SQL Server, modernizing what you have. Some of the differences between the single database. There are some features that are in managed instances that are not in the single databases that a lot of people are excited about. Things like the DMVs, the SQL Server agent. Again, that's an instance level tool, right? The DB mail, change data capture, CLR, cross database transactions, right, is supported because, again, you're working within an instance. These are all things that really separate managed instance versus those single database deployments. We already talked a little bit about the built-in high availability. I'm going to get into that a little bit more when we talk about the different tiers within managed instance. General purpose and business critical are the key buzzwords that you'll hear around that, and we'll dive into that. The SQL auditing, row level security. We already talked about the transparent data encryption. Want to talk real quickly about dynamic data masking, right? This essentially prevents the abuse of sensitive data by hiding it from users. And it's really easily configurable inside the Azure portal. It's policy driven at both the table and column level for a defined set of users. It's also applied in real time to query results based on the policies that you create. And also there are multiple masking functions available, such as full or partial for various sensitive data categories like credit card numbers or social security numbers and things of that nature. So this last bullet point here with the network security, that kind of takes us right into the next slide that I want to talk about. It's very important. Usually, there was two fears, right? Who can access my data into the cloud, right? And how do we isolate that workload, right? It's extremely important that we isolate our SQL Server workloads from the rest of our environment. And SQL Server Database Managed Instance provides complete isolation of those workloads through the native VNet support. So during the service provisioning, whether it be through Azure Portal or through the REST API, you can choose the virtual network and the subnet to achieve that full network isolation. Once created, the instances in the VNet can be reached using Azure networking mechanisms such as VPN or express route gateways. It's also important to understand if anybody finishes this call today and jumps in the Azure portal and wants to spin a managed instance up, the very first time you do that, because there is some serious allocation of resources to you, it does take about 6 hours to spin up the first one. I think mine completed in 5 hours and 35 minutes. So just bear that in mind if you want to spin one of these up. And then I'll show you during the demo, hopefully we have the time, in terms of how to connect SQL Server Management Studio to that instance as well. You can use an existing virtual network that you already have defined within your Azure, in your subnet, but it has to be configured a certain way to meet the managed instance virtual network requirements. I recommend that you create your own brand new virtual network when you create a managed instance, because it will define those requirements and implement those requirements during the provisioning of the managed instance. When the MI is created, Azure is going to allocate a number of virtual machines depending on the tier you selected during provisioning. Because the virtual machines are allocated with your subnet, they do require IP addresses. To ensure high availability during regular operations and service maintenance, Azure may allocate additional virtual machines. As a result, and this is about as deeply technical as I'm going to get with you folks today. As a result, the number of required IP addresses in a subnet is larger than the number of managed instances in that subnet. So it's important to size the subnet correctly. Azure uses 5 IP addresses in a subnet for its own needs. For a general purpose managed instance, you need 2 IP addresses. For business critical, you need 4. By design, a managed instance needs a minimum of 16 IP addresses in the subnet, but it could use up to 256. So as a result, you can use subnet masks 28 to 24 when defining those IP ranges. So, certainly if you're looking at doing something like this and you're moving from like an Oracle workload on premise or an older SQL server, we certainly want to assist in that, but a big part of that's going to be sizing your environment correctly as well. Okay. So I just want to talk a little bit about what that migration strategy looks like. It's really no different than what migration strategies were in the past. Just want to highlight some of these. You can see here that migrating from SQL Server 2005 to 2017 supported MySQL, Oracle, Mongo. All of those are supported and pretty easy to move into Azure SQL Managed Instances. Certainly, we want to follow the same steps as before. We want to assess, right? This is the planning required to do the migration. We want to use Data Migration Assistant tool, which has been used for years now, to check the readiness and effort and sizing, capabilities, feature parities, all the things that we have to look for during an assessment. And then decide what the migration strategy is going to be, whether it's going to be a rehost, lift and shift, refactor, which is basically containerizing, re-architect with some significant changes, or rebuild. So if you're running an old application that's leveraging Mapper as a back end, we're probably going to have to rebuild that one. So we want to assess what the workloads are, maybe identify the priorities and how to move those to the cloud, and then come up with that migration strategy. For the actual migration itself, leveraging SQL Server Migration Assistant for the schema migrations. After the schema, then it's time to migrate the data, right? So Azure Database Migration Services supports online migrations to reduce the downtime and has resiliency built in so it can recover from any errors seamlessly. The Azure Database Migration Service, if you're not familiar with that, that is a cloud service that sits behind Azure Resource Manager. And because of this, the tool is exposed to the API layer and can be accessed by the Azure portal or PowerShell or CLI or SQL SDK. Once we go ahead and move everything up there, we want to optimize, right? We want to optimize in terms of did we choose the right amount of virtual cores? So we want to let it run for a little bit, see what's actually being used, what the workload entails in terms of throughout the year, where the peaks are. And then also we want to optimize the cost savings, right? Is it the right level of high availability that you need? Do we need to switch to more of an always-on solution? So I believe in each step of these processes are areas where Planet can really assist you and your organization. I'm going to try to talk very quickly. I know this is a huge topic that folks will want to talk about. But again, in terms of security for Azure SQL, whether it's a single database, an elastic pool, or a managed instance, it's defense in depth, right? We already talked about threat detection, which can identify the SQL injections and unfamiliar principles and things of that nature. There's a whole component that falls under the SQL, what they call SQL information protection, which is in the preview stage that I had mentioned about. That's a lot, that coincides with the information protection. This allows you to do the labeling, right, and monitoring and auditing that you're used to. I'm very excited as they start to build this out. We talked a little bit about the threat detection as well, to detect the anomalous database activities that can indicate a potential threat. Configure threat detection policies in Azure Portal, push that up to Azure Monitor as well, so you have close to a single pane of glass to view all of these. And then, of course, the SQL auditing, which is integration with log analytics and event hubs for SQL database pools. That's also on preview as well. There's a very large topic, and I know I'm kind of glossing it over here, but certainly this is something that as we take a look at what you could potentially move into the cloud, see what the requirements are around security, and then we can dive deeper into each one of these topics. All right. So in terms of the service tiers, this gives you a really good look at what your choices are. I just want to see, make sure I'm building this out fully without moving to the next slide. I already mentioned the two key buzzwords here. You're looking at general purpose. This is really meant for your non-tier 1 production workloads. You can choose anywhere from 8 to 80 virtual cores. Your high availability, as mentioned before, is based in geo-redundant storage for restores, and I'm going to show you a little bit about how that's done. You can see the types of storages that's available. You can see that, again, because it's not made for tier 1 production workloads, there's no in-memory OLTP, which is where you're going to see a huge explosion in the capabilities of performing queries. And you can also see kind of what this looks like compared to AWS as well in terms of cost. Now, what I don't have built into this is the ability to prepay, right? That 1 to 3 years, which also reduces the cost of managed instance as well. I certainly leave sometimes the cost to people who are a little bit more familiar in terms of how that all works with a existing EA. But on this next slide, I think it gives you a good view of how do you leverage your current on-premise SQL Server licensing and take that to Azure SQL Platform as a Service. So if you own a standard license core today, one, that equals one general purpose core in the cloud. If you own one enterprise license core today, that equals one business critical core in the cloud. And if you own one enterprise licensing core on premise, maybe that you're using to run a lot of dev test servers in there, that equals 4 general purpose cores. So with that, we can start leveraging, we can start doing the math on what you own, what it is you want to run in the cloud, and see if it's already covered based off of what you own today. And reserved capacity is what I was speaking to before. I kind of lost that name in my head, but certainly you can reduce the cost as well by using reserved capacity on 1 to 3 year commitments. The exact percentages, I'm happy to get into with you at a later time. One thing I want to mention, this is a Microsoft slide here, and they like to talk about, hey, everything's faster, everything's better in the cloud, which is true. But the one thing I wanted to call out on this slide, and it's not available today, it is in preview, is the hyperscale service tier. So if you have an application that's really big, that really needs some serious performance, you can see here at the very bottom, hyperscale is going to offer 100 terabytes plus. It's a service tier in Azure SQL databases that provide not only up to 100 terabytes of database size, but nearly instantaneous database backups, fast database restores, just higher overall performance to a higher log throughput and faster transaction commit times, regardless of the data volumes that are there. Rapid scale out. You can provision 1 or more read-only nodes for offloading your read workloads and for use as a hot standby like we do in always-on availability groups. You have rapid scale up. You can, in constant time, scale up your compute resources to accommodate heavy workloads as and when needed. So anybody who's got that huge application out there, that is coming with hyperscale. It is in preview. It'd be great to throw a test up there and let you see what its capabilities are. So what are we actually moving? What can we potentially move into Azure, right? We're talking about the OLTP here, right? The transactional databases. What else exists? What's the other components of SQL Server? What does that equal inside of Azure? So with the SQL Server Engine, we have managed instances. If you're using integration services, that's in the Azure Data Factory, full compatibility between the two. If you're running analysis services, that's Azure Analysis Services in Azure. And if we're leveraging reporting services on premise, then we're looking towards Power BI, right, which is starting to gain a lot of traction out there in terms of customers wanting to take a look at that and plug into everything from a hybrid environment and be able to report on it. So that's kind of what the holistic view of the SQL Server universe looks like on premise versus its equivalent inside of Azure, and that's full compatibility between those. I think I'm running close to the end. There we go. Thank God, demo, because I know you guys want to see it. So let me just share out my screen. I do want to refresh because I was having an issue connecting to my jump box earlier today. And there we go. How are we doing on time, Bob?
You're good. You're good. You're good. Let's see the demo.
Perfect. Okay. Can you see my screen?
It's loading. There we go.
Perfect. Okay. So the first thing I want to show you is we talked about some of the dashboards. I have very limited resources running right now inside the Planet demo environment, but this just gives you an idea, right, of how a DBA could configure their own dashboard. I tried to enable the advanced threat detection at the last minute, but I had to go through a few steps and I just ran out of time. To be honest, but here you can see the resource utilization for my managed instances down here if I had had any activity. This is actually a different database just so I could see some graphs that one of my peers has running inside of our demo tenant. This is a single database that they have running, testing out some features and functionalities for a customer of ours. So you look on the left-hand side down here, there's two things I want to show you. We have SQL Server Managed Instances here. You can see my instance, and you can see I have it located in the East US, and you can see it as a SQL Managed Instance there. And when I click inside, kind of take a look around at the menu that we have. Now, this is a general purpose, as small as you get. I think it's 8 V cores, the smallest version that I could get here. You'll see different things in here, but the one thing I wanted to talk about is how to access your instance. So you can't deploy a managed instance and then from my PC spin up SQL Server Management Studio and connect to the managed instance. It has to be in the same subnet. So you have a couple different choices. You can do it with certificates, on-prem with my on-premise machine and connect. There are some PowerShell scripts that you can run to enable that as well. What I chose to do, because it's the quickest one, is to create a virtual machine that's a jump box. And it's in the same subnet as my managed instance, so I didn't have to go through a lot of security loopholes to connect to it because I'm already within the same subnet. And that's one thing I want to kind of show, and it was taking quite a while to spin up that jump box today. I was having a little bit of a hiccup, so I want to get that going as I go through this here. So inside my managed instance, you'll see over here on the left-hand side a lot of the security things that we talked about: the advanced data security, the transparent data encryption, all the same features that other workloads inside of that Azure have, things like locks. So I love this locks feature. It's probably the least talked about feature inside of Azure, but you can do this on almost anything. and I can add different lock types. I can lock it down to read only. I can lock it down so it can't be deleted. If I in the early days of Azure, when people were spinning up workloads willy nilly, typically all in the same subscription. Yeah, if I had a nickel for every time somebody deleted somebody else's workload, I could retire today. So you could come in here and create a lock and say, this thing can't be deleted, right? That way somebody else can't stumble upon it and go ahead and get rid of it. You'll have the activity logs. Tags is another thing like locks that exists where everything else out there. You have the ability to provide metadata to this instance, your connection strings in terms of how to access the SQL Server Managed Instance, whether it be ODBC, PHP, ADO. You have those strings here. The interesting thing that I like here is that you can start leveraging Azure Active Directory for your users, for your admins, for anything inside of the instance itself, versus creating those users inside the instance and having a whole separate list of usernames and passwords and making sure that people are changing the passwords. It locks down the SA user account, so you don't have to worry about that anymore. So a lot of great things in terms of identity and how that corresponds with your managed instance. The one thing I wanted to show you, and again, this wasn't going to be a huge demo because I don't have a lot running in here currently. And I just want to kill a minute here because I want to open up Management Studio real quick in another screen. The one thing I did want to make sure I showed you here is that in the overview for my managed instance, and again, here you go, you see that I am general purpose, generation 5, 32 gigs, 8 virtual cores, as I mentioned. Is down here at the bottom, and this actually took me a little while to find, I have to admit. I wanted to figure out, okay, so I created a user database. It's called Planet Tech DB, which I'll show you in the Management Studio in a minute. But how do I restore it, right? I saw the backups happening. Now, keep in mind, these backups are not within the instance. So if you look in the MSDB databases at the sys tables, like sys.backups, sys.backup logs, you're not going to see any data in there because these backups are actually done in the Azure backbone layer, right? But I could see in the activity log that the backups were occurring. So I wanted to go ahead and say, okay, well, most people are going to ask, how do you restore a database? And I went inside, and here we go. So I have this up and running now in my jump box, and I just want to bring this over here. You see that I'm connecting to my, I am using SQL Server authentication. I apologize. Hopefully you're using Azure Active Directory when you do this. But I'm going to go ahead and connect to my instance now. So you can see this is exactly like what you see when you're running SQL Server on premise, right? And I created a user database. I created this user database, Planet Tech DB. And then I wanted to go ahead and do a restore. And you see you have all the same options, but some of these are going to be locked down, right? Because it's automated by Azure SQL itself. But if you go to the tasks and go to restore, you'll see, and you can tell that these features are coming because they left this here, that you can restore, but you can only restore from a URL. And because we don't have access to the storage container itself, we can't see what the storage container name is or what the database backup names are. So I got stuck, and I was like, okay, well, how do you actually do these? So for right now, and it's very easy, and it's actually simplified. You'll see here on my managed instance view, my user database, and I can click on that. Now I'm at the database level, so I can still do things like I can just lock down this database, right, to make it read only or not be able to delete. I can provide advanced data security on just this DB if I wanted to. So you have instance level features and functionalities, and you have database level features and functionalities. But you'll see up here, I can configure my backup retention here. This would be a great time if everybody could talk. I would say, what's the maximum, right? Quick trivia question. But if you remember, it's 35 days. So you can retain these backups for 7 to 35 days, and you do your restore right here. You just go ahead and click on that, and you can choose what restore point you want to use, from what date. and actually run that restore right here. I imagine that there'll be a lot of additions to the backup and restore capabilities in terms of the GUI itself and how that happens. I wouldn't even be surprised for general purpose if they give access to the storage account itself. Certainly with the business critical, it's an always on deployment, right? So we don't have to worry about the backup so much because you're going to fail over to a secondary long before you ever consider restoring from a backup, unless you have some sort of critical, massive change to your data, or you're losing data in some form or fashion. So that's the one thing I wanted to make sure, because if you spin it up, that's probably the first thing you're going to try to do. And I know I had a little bit of heartache. I was using a different monitor, and it actually cut off right before where it says one managed instance database, and I wasn't seeing it. And then I stumbled upon it late last night. You can change the pricing tiers as well, so certainly you can grow with the workload as you needed. I mean, this kind of gives you a good idea. This is the lowest cost general purpose 8B core, 38 gig of memory monthly cost there. So just for your general idea of what that looks like. But at the end of the day, I really just wanted you to see that when you connect to your SQL Server instance, that you're seeing pretty much all the things that you see within your on-premise deployment. So I highly encourage you in terms of having your DBAs take a look at this and play around with it and get a little comfortable with it. And I think you'll find that they see a ton of value in that. I think that's it for me, Bob. I'm going to try to unshare my desktop. Or you could take control for me, because I'm not quite sure what the last slide is after the demo.
No problem. I'll go ahead. Let me go ahead and bring the presentation back. So thank you, Scott. That's for some insight into some technology that I don't think a lot of customers are that familiar with. Just to close the loop, first of all, make sure if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the window. I got 2 quick slides to finish up with, and then if we want to just ask them via voice, feel free to unmute and ask the questions as well. Scott and I will hang out for as long as we can if there's a need. I love to refer to this as, this webcast was brought to you by Azure Advantage. But in particular, I think this is, particularly relevant based on the conversation. So we're talking about moving database instances into Azure and a number of workloads into Azure, so we continue to work with customers. We have Azure Advantage that's actually been newly revamped for a number of offerings. We run everywhere from sort of the full end-to-end management of your environment all the way up to the application layer, or in the case of SQL Instance, right, managing the most of the care and feeding, of course, is taken care of Microsoft, but there's still some, and those services could be outsourced as well. If you had an instance where, hey, we have an application, we want to install it on Managed Instance, it's I'm just going to make something up, it's a bridges, or it's a toll application, and we want to just, the vendor itself is going to take care of the actual application, but somebody needs to manage the database care and feeding and things that go beyond just what's automated through the Managed Instance scenario. A great opportunity for there. Also, however, running services in Azure Advantage, running all the way from, phone a friend to, hey, I've got some questions around managing this environment. Can you give me some on-demand help on how to do that? To sort of proactive services where an enterprise architect around Azure has, regularly scheduled cadence and participates in your enterprise team meetings, etc. So we sort of run the gamut across there. I want to thank everybody for joining. Are there any questions out there in the audience? Feel free to unmute if you'd like.
Yeah, I had a question. This is Eric.
Hi, Eric.
So what happened to Azure Virtual Machines? Is that what managed instances are now? Or is there still...
So Azure virtual machines are still in existence, right? And in and of itself, whether they be for a database load or any application. The idea here,
Okay.
though, if you're thinking about the comparison, an Azure virtual machine is really just taking your virtual machine instance like that's running on Hyper-V or VMware and putting it in Azure. You still have to patch it, you still have to back it up, you still have to do all those things. So what Azure Managed Instance is all of that stuff is obscured from you, and it's basically just leaving a SQL managed instance available for you to upload your SQL databases into and manage them that way and not have to worry about the care and feeding of the OS, the care and feeding of the basic SQL patches and all of that kind of stuff.
Okay, I see. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yep.
And to add on to that, the biggest expense with your database typically is your high availability and disaster recovery. So the ability to have that built in and not have to have the supporting infrastructure on premise or even within the cloud, you would have to do some sort of always on availability group for, say, like a tier one production workload. So you're still having to manage all of that, right? I mean, Azure Backup makes it a little bit easier for more of a tier two or a colder solution. But at the end of the day, you still have to manage the SQL instance itself, which is, time consuming.
Well, and then on that, I guess, from what I understand, when you go to the cloud, you still have to have like a DRHA strategy, right? Because you can't just, some people I think that if you just go to the cloud, then you're covered, but that's not necessarily true.
Right. So if you lift and shift and you move your SQL Server database to an Azure virtual machine, and say it's a tier one production, then you have to cluster it still, right? Just like you do on premise, or you have to create which is supported, by the way. A lot of people don't know that you can cluster SQL Server VMs in Azure now, or preferably you're doing an always on availability group. So now you have 4 virtual machines running, right? One is a hot standby, maybe one is a reporting read, hot read, and one is an asynchronous, failover. But you still have to manage all those virtual machines, right? Like Bob said, you have to back them up. And then if there's a new SQL Server version, you have to upgrade the SQL Server version. Whereas with the managed instance, you don't have to worry about that, especially with the business critical, which would be that tier one production workload. That always on is set up, maintained, managed as well as the SQL Server instance level, right? So when SQL Server 2022 comes out, right, you'll be on 2022. All that's managed for you on the back end. You no longer have to and that's the sheer amount of time, right, of a DBA. Is doing those two things.
Yeah. So in the
managed it.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So in the managed instance, you do have the HADR functionality already set up, you're saying, or something?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep. Built in for you.
Yep. So it's just a checkbox and a couple of configuration settings, and then it's off it goes. It's managed by Microsoft. They're taking care of the care and feeding. You know that everything that goes into that managed instance now is set up in that, high availability scenario. There's, a couple of options and on from there.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, I want to thank everybody for joining. I think it was a successful call on a very hot topic with a number of our customers. Remember to reach out to the You Already Own It at go-planet.com. If you have any questions concerning this or anything else, feel free to reach out. It goes right to the team. We all see them and respond to them as quickly as we can. So thanks everybody for joining, and we'll see you next month. Thanks.